Hello there, welcome to The Nation. You're with me, Tamina Kazri, coming live from the Bernama News Channel studios. And today on this episode, we kick back a little and turn our eye to some literary interests and a brand new Malaysian book which was just launched in the market, known as Marriage and Mutton Curry. Well, I have with me in the studios right now live none other than the author himself, Dato Dr. M. Shan, who's here to speak a little bit about the importance of cultural identity, heritage, and how that richly plays out in this new book. Dato, how are you today?
Very well, thank you.
All right.
I'm happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here, especially because it's been pretty busy, as I hear, after the launch of Marriage and Mutton Curry. So tell us what inspired you, now that you're already in retirement, but to put your nose to the ground and actually go forth with getting this book of 15 short stories out in the market.
Well, actually, I'm not in retirement. I'm no longer in the Ministry of Finance or Petronas, but I'm a consultant in the private sector, so I work full-time.
Okay.
I've had my stories and poems in 37 different anthologies, but I felt it was time for me to pull them together into one book. So I selected the best 9 published stories. Then I wrote 6 new ones. They are longer and darker than the first 9. And even the ones that were published, the famous novelist Dash Orr told me that even if they're already published, you should rewrite them and see how they fit in with the whole collection. So although they are short stories, the story of how I got there is a long one. How did I get to these 15 short stories?
Right, so how you got to those 15 short stories, Dr. Shan, let's start off first with what these 15 short stories are about. Now, you have always highlighted the importance and the role and the influence of your Jaffna Tamil cultural background.
Yes.
Tell us why this plays such a big role in your writing, not just this collection, but all the others as well.
Well, you see, from the time I was a child, we lived in government quarters for clerks. And at that time, most of the clerks were Jaffna Tamils, and we lived in link houses. So women could talk across from one door to the other, and I could hear. I was a preschool kid at home. My father was at work all day. So I could hear them chatting, and the sort of things they said. This dialogue is still swimming in my head. And that's why my stories begin with dialogue. And the Jaffna Tamils, as commented by both our first Prime Minister here, Tunku Abdul Rahman, and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, they've always punched well above their weight. They produced the first Education Minister in Malaya then, Dato Sir Clive Thuraisingham, 2 Deputy Prime Ministers in Singapore, the present Deputy Prime Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam, and the former one S. Rajaratnam, one of the leading non-Chinese tycoons in Malaysia, Ananda Krishnan, who worked with Petronas to build the iconic Twin Towers, the fastest man in Asia, and a large number of highly reputable and regarded doctors, lawyers, engineers, and freedom fighters.
So definitely, it's been a huge highlight of the Malaysian diaspora as well. That the Jaffna Tamil community has always stood out. Now, what I find fascinating, Doctor, is that you decided to not only write a book entitled Marriage and Mutton Curry, but one focusing on both the inner as well as the public lives of Tamil Jaffna women.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, that comes a lot from the fact how you grew up and your situation. And one could be forgiven for thinking that this is a chick lit book because of the bright colors and etc. But you also mentioned something darker.
Yes. Number of things. One is that many of my characters are women, and they're strong characters, but they're faced with men who are more powerful than them. So they're in an unequal power situation. So the stories show how they cope or do not cope with men, even though they are strong characters, with men who are very powerful. And it looks at this whole idea of inequality. How do people cope with inequality? And I think that's a recurring issue all over the world.
Absolutely.
The question of inequality of all kinds of incomes and all that. But at the heart of it is inequality of power. And so these women, one of their vehicles was the kitchen. They cooked. Like, for example, my mother was such a great cook that people would come from outside to take cooking lessons from my mother.
Right.
So food was very important. The other was humor. Humor enables you to deal with people who are more powerful or very serious. Diffuse the situation. And it's a common language among all Malaysians. In fact, some foreigners have observed, while we are eating one meal, we're already talking about what's the next meal we're going to have.
That's right.
And the Japanese Tamils, they were very austere, very careful about not wasting. For example, they would say, if you see somebody opening a gift-wrapped present, you can tell who's a Japanese Tamil because he won't rip it apart. He'll open it so gently so that the wrapper can be reused again.
Oh wow, okay, that sounds like something I learned from my Parsi grandmother,
Really?
so I'm just wondering.
Okay.
All right, so on that note, time for a quick commercial break. We'll be back right after. Please do stay tuned. Okay.
Listen to views of industry captains. Analyze and examine trends and projections. Gain market insights from subject matter experts. Biz Talk every Friday only on BNC.
Brings you the latest in current affairs, lifestyle and entertainment, as well as one-on-one discussions with fascinating personalities. Only on Bernama News Channel.
Welcome back to our literary conversation on the newly launched Malaysian book Marriage and Mutton Curry with the author Dr. M. Shan. So, Doctor, as you were saying, now food also forms the whole cultural dimension shaping the Jaffna Tamil community, and the importance of it can barely be overemphasized, as is the title of the book, Marriage and Mutton Curry. Now, tell us a little bit about some of your fondest memories that actually brought you to the point that you wanted to put it down on paper and actually make a book about the importance of food for this culture.
Well, I think food is so basic that, as I mentioned, it's a common denominator for everyone. And Tamil food, even if it's vegetarian, can be very tasty. In fact, if I consider vegetarian food, it's very hard to beat Tamil vegetarian food because of the blend of spices that they use. So that helps one to make things lighter at home because they were such great cooks. Second, to link with people of other communities. People of different communities came to our house because of my mother's great cooking. Even though my father was very serious looking and stern, they would just dash past him. He was sitting in the
That was the lure of your mother's cuisine.
He would be sitting at his desk and just look up and look so stern that they wouldn't know what to say to him. They dash past him and go to the kitchen and have a great time, you know.
So when we also speak about the fact that what type of literature would you categorize the stories that you write? Are they romantic? Are they mysterious? What type of texture is there?
I'd say they are mainstream, but comedy of manners, in the tradition of, say, R.K. Narayan, who's one of the people I read a lot when I was a student, or Jane Austen later, comedy of manners. And but I've also have a more serious purpose. I tried to show three distinct periods in Malaysia and Singapore's history: British colonial period, Japanese occupation, and the immediate years after independence. Chinua Achebe has done it in Nigeria, but with more serious novels. But I look at these three periods, and what I do is, because there's a gap among Malaysian readers between those who read fiction and the many who read non-fiction, I'm trying to bridge that gap. And I do it via faction.
Yes, you often describe your writing as faction.
Yes.
Tell us what that means.
Yes. You see, I've also written a draft memoir, and I found the draft memoir very stifling, because I couldn't say that so-and-so's father had the following vices, because the children are around, and I don't want to hurt the children. Secondly, with fiction, I can make an amalgamation of 6 characters. So none of the characters in my book, or very few, represent one particular person. Almost all of them are an amalgamation of different characters. So they are more rounded and have more complexity. They are deeper because they're a mixture of different people represented by one character.
Right.
So that makes it much more interesting and challenging. And these 15 stories, they cover quite a wide range. The first 2 are about the cross-section between the British colonial and Japanese occupation. Then they go on to my experience in the Treasury and the Civil Service, people from the World Bank coming to visit, and the extent of miscommunication between foreign investors and Malaysians, and how we outwitted them deliberately or otherwise. Then we go on to the stories about the Japanese Tamils themselves, and next are a couple of very dark stories, which is quite unusual for me. Most of my stories are not dark.
Yes, you do always focus on the fact that it's humorous. Now, you were telling me earlier, Dr. Shan, that you would love to actually read a short extract, one that truly showcases the type of humor that is there rife throughout Marriage and Mutton Curry. Would you do us the pleasure?
Yes, with great pleasure. No, I won't call him puppy. It makes the devil sound cute. Then what name to give him, Mrs. Chelia giggled. I'll call him that dirty small dog. If he comes near my home, I'll let loose my outstation dog on him. You mean Alsatian dog? No need to repeat after me. I'm your elder, not your school teacher. After that terrible insult, he won't have any face left to show in Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, or any other paw. Mrs. Chelia, imagine this rogue, once the lights are switched off, corrupting her with a K and a C. Kueh kochi and curry puff? Ayo, a kiss and a cuddle. Even our unshy Tamil film stars don't kiss on the screen.
All right, so I think that gives us a little bit of an insight into the idiosyncrasies of the characters as well as their strengths. Now, let's move a little bit into documenting the Malaysian experience, which is also what you are in your own way doing through these stories. Why is that so important to you, Dr. Shan?
Okay. You see, they say that in Africa, when an elder dies, a whole library is burned down. Now,
that's a wonderful and heartwarming way of putting it as well.
Thank you. In Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in the third world, we don't document things, we don't write down. Whereas the British colonials, for example, they kept such meticulous records, annual reports. You can go to the Rhodes House Library in Oxford and say, I want the drainage and irrigation report of
from
Kedah,
this and this year.
of Kedah for 1947.
Right.
Here you are. Meticulous records, they kept diaries, they even wrote dictionaries of, say, Malay, English. So I think it's so important to record these. Otherwise, when we die, our libraries are also burned down. And the next generation thinks that we always had air-conditioned shopping complexes, houses, offices, cars, and so forth. They have no idea that our grandparents died of malaria, of TB, trying to build up roads, lay railway lines. They have no idea of what previous generations went through. And I'm saying that how do you know where you want to go if you don't know where you've come from? But what is your sense of direction?
Yes, and Malaysia is such a rich tapestry of the various cultures and communities that actually came about to bring in. What are you hoping to be able to tell the Jaffna Tamil community through this book in particular?
Well, I'm one of them, so I'm not laughing at them. I'm laughing with them at all our hang-ups, our foibles, our intrigues, and our consciousness of status. You see, they have great reverence for education. And even in the colonial times, Ceylon had some of the best educational institutions in the whole of Asia. And they brought that reverence of education when they came abroad. And so for the children, my father would wake us up at 4 in the morning with just one word, study.
That's right.
And we jump up and we study. Because he said, you are a minority, you have to run very fast to just keep still with the others. So education was a very big thing, and so were medical doctors. So you study with the
And I
aim
think
of
that branches off into a far more fascinating conversation about
Yes.
status, class, and the
Yes.
intersection of it. We'll get back to that
Okay.
right after this commercial break. Do stay tuned.
how many
Laporan pelbagai dimensi memaparkan isu semasa, rancangan warisan dan budaya dari dalam dan luar negara. Saksikan jurnal Bernama News Channel, semuanya tentang anda.
Tiada agenda tersembunyi. Tiada ruang berteka-teki. Temu bual eksklusif menjawab segala persoalan. Saksikan Up Sound setiap Rabu 8.30 malam hanya di Bernama News Channel. Semuanya tentang anda.
Welcome back to our conversation on a quintessentially Malaysian book which has just launched, Marriage and Mutton Curry. So, Dr. Shan, as you were saying, now the importance of education cannot be overemphasized, especially in the type of community and household that you grew up in. Let's relate that back into the obsession of a lot of the female characters that are seen in your stories with not just themselves marrying well, but ensuring that their children marry well
Yes.
and do well academically, especially.
Well, I think because there's this concern about status, that education would be the main vehicle to
Upward mobility.
for upward mobility.
That's right.
And then if you have daughters, if they marry doctors, that would be another form of upward mobility. So it all begins with education. So from there, and the men, they showed very little emotion. Their focus was on their job, on their career, and they worked really long hours.
Strong,
And
silent figures.
Yes, and they're very proud of the fact, in a whole year, I haven't taken any vacation leave.
Right.
They were workhorses and proud of it.
And what about the women? And what dimension did that bring into the interpersonal relationships of all of these couples as well?
Well, I think a lot of the women, because the men were out at work all day, they had to spend more time with either each other, with other women, or with the children. Because the father was this strong, silent figure who was working all the time. And my father, if he wasn't working when he was at home, he was reading. So I was quite fascinated by this combination of work and reading. And that led, and my mother telling me stories from nursery rhymes to Aesop's fables, led me to go into reading classical, illustrated classic comics, and then on to writing.
Naturally.
Yes.
Now, when you speak about reading, I have to ask you this, Dr. Shan.
Yes.
What about the reading culture in Malaysia right now? You can write all the books in the world that you
Yes.
want,
Yes.
but if nobody in the domestic market is going to be reading it, in particular fiction or non-fiction or faction like you write,
Yes.
how can we inculcate this in the current generation, the babies of today?
Yeah. Actually, Sultan Nazrin has anticipated your question
Right.
when he very graciously launched my book. He mentioned that a report published in 2016 found that only 3% of Malaysians read books. And this very small fraction read either non-fiction, fiction by foreign writers, many of whom are dead white men, or finally fiction written by Malaysians. And he asked, how do we nurture and widen this group? He said, writing historical fiction, as Shan does, is one way to contribute, to reach out to those who only read facts and figures. And as a book of short stories, Marriage and Mutton Curry would appeal to those who travel frequently on buses, MRT, LRT, taxis, trains.
That's right. And of
And
course,
this-
in the background, we're playing an article clipping also of when Sultan Nazrin actually launched your book recently at the Kuala Lumpur Festival.
yes.
So I think you've got all of the support backing the book, and I think it's highly anticipated in the market. What are some of what is the biggest reason, the ethos, that you would give the reader out there why they should read Marriage and Mutton Curry?
Well, they should read Marriage and Mutton Curry to empathize with our forefathers. What did they go through during the British colonial period, during the Japanese occupation, during the early years of independence, to empathize, not just events and dates of history, but to put yourself in the shoes of the people who pioneered to build this country.
Living history.
All the things they went through. And important characteristics. For example, in one story there's Tan Sri Abdullah, the Chief Secretary, who shows kasihan. That's very uniquely Malaysian. This capacity to empathize, this capacity for compassion. So history may not show you all that, but historical fiction will show you the feelings of people, and when somebody is in a bad way, how somebody else who's powerful can kasihan and empathize and show a deeper understanding.
And as for the Tamil Jaffna community, because you are, as a Tamil Jaffna man, you are though writing about the women in your community, how have you seen the women progress or come into their own, really, from the years when you were a child to today in 2018?
I show it symbolically in my book. The protagonist, Rasama, her lifelong aim was a particular vocation, and the readers will see whether she gets it or she doesn't. But in the last story, Rani taxis away. Rani seems to have got the vocation that Rasama aspired for, and it happens at the time of independence. So it's independence for the country and also independence for the young Jaffna Tamil women.
Very
so
true.
It's symbolically a reincarnation of Rasama in the form of Rani, who has greater success achieving the dreams of Rasama.
Now, do you have a favorite character from your 15 stories, Dr. Shan?
Well, you know, the 15 stories are like my 15 children, so it's very hard to play favorites.
Pick and choose.
And,
I
you know,
understand.
pile kase with your stories. But I would say maybe the major character who comes out in different reincarnations is Rasama, who in the last story comes out as Rani.
And
Reincarnation.
And who's the most unlovable of the characters?
That's difficult because they're complex. I think evil is more complex than people who are good.
Just black or white,
Yeah,
yes.
there's Indra, who suffered a lot when her husband was around, and then who took it out because her sister was the cause of her suffering. There's Chelvi, who was conniving and betrayed Rasama because she wanted her daughter to marry the doctor who wanted to marry Rasama's daughter.
Right, so it's very convoluted.
Yes,
There are many,
yes.
Personal histories as
Yes.
well as angst and anguishes going on there.
Yes.
Now, where next from here, Dr. Shan?
Well, I have a number of options. One is I have a draft memoir, whether now that I've tried fiction, whether I should move on to non-fiction, or poetry. I have, like my short story, I have many published poems, but I have some new ones too, whether I should do that or write children's stories. I haven't decided. But at the moment, my publisher in Singapore, all his costs are in Singapore dollars, but we are selling here in Malaysia at 30% discount to the Singapore price. So he says he has to sell 5,000 copies just to recover his costs. So I have to focus on
Sales first.
Yes, promoting the book.
We understand. And which bookstores is Marriage and Mutton Curry currently available at, Dr. Shan?
MPH ordered some 560 copies. I'm told that Popular is asking for 300, and Borders and Times have asked for 70 each, and Silverfish 2 to 3 copies. So
It's
the
well
major
spread
bookstores,
out, right?
yes, yes.
Yeah, pretty well
and
spread out.
Gerak Budaya is the distributor
I see.
for the whole country.
Well,
on
we
behalf
wish you
of Epigram
all the
Publishers.
best with the book sales themselves. But now, turning our eye to the social conditions in New Malaysia, what is your message to not just the young Malaysian reader, but the young Malaysian now? Looking back as somebody who did serve as a civil servant previously, what is the hope for the future that you see? What is the opportunity, and what are some of the challenges that you'd like to share?
I think to be aware that we are now in a global world, and therefore we have to be competitive globally. We can no longer be jago kampong. We have to sharpen our skills, be flexible, be adaptable, be able to understand the other person's perspective when you're negotiating. You have to see where the other person is coming from. And I think these books of this 15 stories would equip them with the history, not only of Malaysians, but also colonial powers, the British, the Japanese, so forth, and now of course we have the Americans, maybe later China, how Malaysians dealt with more powerful countries and how we need to be competitive to stay alive.
Right.
I think that would be among the many messages from this book.
Perfectly put. Dr. Shan, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you. We wish you all the best with Marriage and Mutton Curry. So there you have it, in a nutshell, this brand new book which you should definitely try and check out and get your hands on. I'm Tamina Kausji signing off on The Nation. We'll see you again next week.